This is The Right Approach. I am J.W. Judge, and with me is my co-host Barbara Hinsky. This is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft of writing as we explore a new topic every week. Our guest today is Matty Dalrymple. For the last 6 years, she has hosted the Indie Author Podcast. She's written books about podcasting and about creating income from writing short fiction. She is the author of a couple of series, the Ann Kinnear paranormal suspense novels, and the Lizzie Ballard thriller series. So, Matty, welcome to The Right Approach.
Thank you. It's very exciting to be here, especially with a follow-up on some of the fantastic guests you've had.
Well, thanks. We have been, this is, I think this will be episode 13. We're kind of recording out of order, so remembering where each one falls is difficult. But yeah, we've been really fortunate to have some really great guests early on here. And today we're here to talk with you about an article you wrote for Writer's Digest a few months ago called Creating Your Story Frame. And since story structure is one of my favorite writing topics, and I know Barbara and I have talked about it several times on air and off air, we wanted to have you on and talk about this.
Great. I appreciate the invitation.
So let's start with this, because it's prevalent both in the article itself and in the logo for your podcast. Tell us about your affinity for things nautical.
Oh, yes. Well, anyone who's watching the video can see that I even have my room decorated with a nautical themed poster. But yeah, I just have never found any concept in the writing craft or the publishing voyage that didn't have a great nautical metaphor. And in fact, I used that in the book I wrote with Mark Leslie Lefebvre on short fiction. It's called Taking the Short Tack. And when we were getting near the end of writing the book and had to come up with a title, and I had really wanted to use a nautical metaphor, and I got in touch with a sailor friend of mine, and I said, can you send me all the nautical terms that have the word short in it? And so one of them was short tack, and I started looking up short tack because there was a period of my life when I was doing a lot of boating, but it had been some time ago. So I was refreshing my memory about what short tack was, and everything about it was just perfect for what I wanted to convey. It's how you navigate in a constricted waterway. It's something that you can use if your engine goes out, a way to get back to the marina. And so, just one thing after the other had great analogies to what I wanted to say about short fiction, and just everything. And building the story frame was one of those things that I had wanted to share with other writers, the approach I had used to try to avoid some of the pain that I experienced with my fifth Ann Kinnear book in terms of getting the plot lined up. And I realized that was exactly analogous to a boat frame, that if you're a boat builder, you don't start with the transom, you don't start polishing the wheel, you build the frame. And you need to understand whether you're building a tugboat or a canoe when you do that. And so everything about it, as with everything else with nautical metaphors, was just a great way of conveying what I wanted to say to my fellow writers.
All right, so you talk in the article about making sure, and you alluded to it here already, about making sure that the frame of your story is in place before you begin the work of writing it. And I know that some listeners hearing that will already start nodding their head, while there will certainly be others who are ready to change the podcast just at the very suggestion of something like that.
Don't change yet.
Yeah, don't change
Hang
it.
with us.
Hang out on this topic for a while. So what does it mean to you to make sure that the frame of your story is in place?
Well, I'll just tell very briefly the experience I'd had that made me come up with the concept of the frame. And that was, I was working on Ann Kinnear book 5, which became A Serpent's Tooth. I had published a book in April of last year, and I had a goal of getting The Serpent's Tooth out by October. And so during the summer, I had sent my editor an early draft, not an early draft, but not a completely polished draft, but something for him to look through and see how things were going. And there were many good things about that draft, but there were some real problems with the draft too. Like, he got to the end, he said, I don't know, I'm just not buying the motivation of the bad guy. That's a problem. And so as I went through it and found ways to fix those things that he had pointed out needed to be fixing, there was this huge ripple effect through the whole book. if the motivation of the bad guy isn't clear, then you either have to find another bad guy or you have to make it clear throughout the story what the motivation is. And even small things were problematic. So in the draft that I'd sent to my editor, I had a woman who was pregnant. She was just barely pregnant. So, when people found out she was pregnant, it would be a surprise for them. And then later I realized it was much better if she was quite pregnant. So I had to go find all those places where people were saying, oh, you're pregnant? Who would have known? And so, from very large aspects to very small aspects, there was a lot of rework that needed to be done. And my target publication date of October came and went, November came and went, December came and went. And it actually wasn't until April that I got that book out. It was like 2 days before the anniversary of the previous book. And that was a little closer than I wanted to cut it. So when I started working on book 6, I was determined I was not going to do that again. And so the approach I took was this frame to make sure that I understood at kind of a medium level of detail where the plot was going, where the story was going. And so the approach I used was that I started writing out what was going to happen in present tense, starting with the name of the point of view character of that scene. So Anne wakes up in her home and walks up the hill to visit her brother Mike. And I did the whole book with sort of that level of detail. And in the process of doing that, I realized some issues in what I had in my mind, and I had a chance to work that out. Maybe when I was done with that, I had 4,000 words of what would eventually be about 85,000 word book. And then I started at the beginning and I started it again. And I went through and I would say, Anne wakes up in her current home and walks up the hill to visit her brother, Mike, to talk about a engagement that Mike is hoping that she takes on. And so each time I made a pass, it became more and more detailed until I had a frame of about 40,000 words for this 85,000 word book. And for that book, I sent that to my editor. And I said, okay, what do you think of the plot as it played out? And he highlighted a couple of issues. He sort of said, I can imagine that in the writing of this, you could address this, but in the form it is now, here's a question I have. And they were all completely legitimate concerns. And I was able to fix them fairly easily in the 40,000 words I had. Not the 85,000 words that included all the dialogue and detail, which is basically what I left out of the frame. And so I feel like it saved me a lot of pain, not all the pain, but a lot of pain that I otherwise would have experienced again with Anne Kinnear 6.
Can I ask, how long did it take you to come up with your 40,000 word frame? And then how long did it take you from there to add to, spin it out into your finished product?
Well, so my last book came out in April of 2022. We're recording this in October of 2022. Mm-hmm. I just sent that book to my first beta reader. So I can't say that I did that in 6 months because I was working on the frame of that. Like while my editor had book 5, I was working on the frame for book 6. So it took me a couple of months at least in the schedule that I followed to get to that 40,000 word frame. And then the remainder of that time was fleshing it out with the dialogue and the details. And I have to admit, doing a certain amount of rework. So the frame was not a fail-safe to keep me from doing any rework. As an example, sure. I usually have to have 2 storylines going in the Anne Kinnear books because Anne is a woman who has a business related to her ability to sense spirits. It's run by her brother. It's very businesslike. They have contracts, they have engagements. It's just like she's an accountant or something. And so I usually have to have another storyline to get Anne involved before there's a dead person that she's trying to contact. And so the sub storyline I had was Anne contacts her dead mother or tries to contact her dead parents. And I had sent that to the editor and the editor thought that sounded fine. And then as I was fortunately not fleshing it out, I was fleshing out the other storyline. And then I went back to flesh out the Anne storyline. And I thought, if the protagonist is going to talk to her dead parents, that kind of deserves a book unto itself.
I would think. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I ended up setting that aside using, I still have that material, that frame as the basis for the next vessel I decide to launch into. But I ended up having to create a secondary storyline. Now it would be super fun if I could have said I found that in the framing process and that was in the frame I sent to my editor. But it didn't save me from that hiccup, but it did save me from many hiccups in the main storyline.
Sure.
So in your article, I think you kind of distinguished this process from outlining. And so tell me, I think there's probably some crossover, some overlap about what those are, but you mentioned that the thought of outlining it felt too constrictive for you. So tell me, what's different between what you are doing and what you think of as outlining?
Yeah, I think that's why I wanted your listeners to hang out, even if they were put off at first by what we were talking about, because to me, an outline means you pull up Word, you put like Roman numeral 1 and you write something, and then you have like indented capital A. And that's not at all what this was. And I wouldn't like to do an outline for book myself. I know many people that works fine for. And if it does, then keep doing it, because, whatever's helping you get words on the page is what you should be doing. But I felt as if the outline is something separate that's very structured like that, then I also would share the concern that I think many authors have that, oh no, I'm locking myself into this by doing this outline. To me, the benefit of the frame is that you're doing something that eventually just morphs into the book itself. So at some point, when I was going from 40,000 words to 85,000 words, at some point I stopped putting it in present tense. So instead of Anne walks up the hill to have the meeting with her brother, it's, Anne slipped into a red parka and poured a cup of coffee and started up the hill to the big house at the top of the hill. And I also actually changed the font. So when I'm writing the frame, I use a sans serif font. When I'm writing the actual manuscript, I use a serif font. And just that change of font and also change of color helps me keep myself in the mindset that I want to be in at that moment. And, as we've already talked about, having the frame for Anne meets her dead mother didn't keep me from adjusting that. If you're building the boat and you realize that you're going to need extra support at a point of the boat to enable you to do with the boat what you want to, then you can fix it in the frame. So the frame, in my mind, gives me all the flexibility I need. Whereas if I were using an outline, I would not feel that flexibility.
So, Barb, what's your approach as you start preparing to write and then eventually do write your story? What's your approach for this?
I was going to jump in. I write, in a maybe what I would call a frame adjacent kind of way. But yes, I like that because I've had the same experience. I spin out a whole book and then my editor says, well, you're like missing a whole subplot. And going back to page 1, word 1, and weaving in a whole new subplot with new characters is a tedious operation. And I like, I guess I've called it outlining, but what I do is not the romanettes and all that kind of stuff. It's just sort of a loose thing on the page. I may try this font thing. I think that's interesting. But for those podcasters who are still white knuckling through this, listeners, because they don't like the idea of doing anything but pantsing, one of the advantages, and I think you will both agree with this, is that at least if you've got a framework, writer's block doesn't play much of a factor. There's always, you can look at something, point your arrow, and go there and write that scene. So that makes it efficient. And listening how fast she's getting out an 85,000 word book, I don't think this is slowing you down.
So in my third book that came out in September, that was part of a series, exciting. I had characters that were split up into 2 different places. And one of the characters. It was immediately picking up where the second novel had left off, like hours later. And I knew where one of the characters was and what they were going to experience. And I didn't have a full realization of, I knew, well, let me say, I knew generally what was going to happen in the story, but not specifically. And so what I did was I wrote, this piggybacks on what Barb was just saying. I wrote the first 5 or 6 chapters that were going to involve the character that I knew what was going on. And I just wrote those things because I knew generally where it was going to fall within my framework. And then what I use is I have a spreadsheet that I have created based off of the story grid method that Sean Coyne uses and promotes. And I just created this spreadsheet that all of my stories so far have been action stories at their base. And so I kind of organize it in a 3-act structure. And, you've got your inciting incident and your climax and resolution and all the things that need to happen within each act to move the story along. And so I keep a spreadsheet with a description and, what day it is in the story and all this information. And so I was able to go ahead and write those, even though I didn't know what was going on with everybody else. I had this structure that I knew generally was going to happen. And so I was able to write her scenes and plug them in where I thought they would fit. And I didn't get stuck with writer's block of not knowing everything that was going to happen in the story, because her story gave me context for the other stories that by the time I was ready, I could go back in and jump on those. And so that was an advantage for me in doing that.
Yeah, similarly with me, the fact that I could get through the whole main plot of Ancaneer 6 and come back later and reassess the subplot was really valuable. And also, and here's the Excel nerd portion of the episode, that I also have a spreadsheet that I use in conjunction with the frame, and it has characters across the top and chapters down the side. And so at some point in the framing process, I get too confused. Even with like 20,000 words, I'm getting too confused because I've thought of 17 different approaches for a particular plot branch, and I forget which one I've picked. So when I start getting confused in that way, I go to the spreadsheet, and in each cell I put, what does that character know, think, and feel at that point? So in the Anne column for chapter 1, it might say, Anne walks to the office, not yet knowing what engagement Mike wants to talk with her about. And I do that for all the chapters and all the characters to the extent that it's helpful. And then that enables me to read across a row and see what's going on with all the characters at a particular point in the story, and read down a column and see the evolution of a particular character within the story. And it has saved me, not only high level sort of character development issues, but don't act like this person hasn't met this person yet if they met them 2 chapters ago. Like, don't have them introduce each other twice, and has saved me a lot of those things. And again, I only use that until it's useful. So at some point, I remember what branch I chose. And so I don't have to keep going back to the spreadsheet. I don't think I've ever updated a spreadsheet all the way through the drafting of a book, only until it stops being useful to me, and then I set it aside. And I will also say that the beauty of that is you can add all sorts of things, as you're suggesting with the story grid reference. You could put, for example, one of my editors used to assess each chapter by emotional intensity and physical activity. And so you might have 2 people sitting at a table in a restaurant having an argument, and that's low physical activity, but it's high emotional intensity. Or you might have someone who's out for the morning jog, which is high, physical activity, low emotional intensity. And then you can, even if you're super nerdy, you can graph that, and you can see like how that pattern emerges through the story, and make sure you don't have like a whole big pack of very emotionally intense chapters all together, and then another pack of emotionally intense chapters after that.
Well, it sounds like the spreadsheets that you both do help you make sure that main characters get on the stage at regular intervals. I like to write linearly. So I'll have long swaths and I'm like, wait a minute, we don't need to tie this up all in one fell swoop. We need to bring, my main protagonist has been off the page for 3 chapters. I better get her back on there. So I think that what you're doing is probably just takes that out of the equation, which is wonderful. I don't know if I want to jump ahead, or Jeremy, you can tell me to wait on this. But I'm so fascinated by your short fiction initiatives. How is that working out? Because I see you've got your Ann Kinnear series, which those books are long if they're 85,000 words, but you've got some shorts in there, like 25 pages, which is not many words at all. So is that working for you?
Well, I had gotten into short fiction because when I wrote the first two Ann Kinnear suspense novels, The Sense of Death and The Sense of Reckoning, after those, I had another idea for a character who has a special ability. So sort of the theme of my books is what happens when an extraordinary ability transforms an ordinary life. And for Anne, the extraordinary ability is that she can communicate with dead people. And I had another idea that I wanted to pursue, but it really didn't fit into the Ann Kinnear world. And so that became the Lizzie Ballard thriller. So I sort of said to my Anne fans, just hold on. I have this idea for another book. I'll just get this out of the way and then I'll be back to Anne. And then I got to the end of that book, which was Rock, Paper, Scissors, and realized that it wasn't standalone. It was going to be at least 2. So I said to the Anne fans, just hold on for one more book. And it turned out to be a trilogy. So I was telling the Anne fans to hold on for a really long time. And I wanted to give them something to sort of tide them over until I had another Anne book for them. And so I started writing the suspense shorts. And it was easy for the Anne series because she does have this business. She has a professional, her profession is contracting with people to talk to dead people. So I was able to use that in a lot of fun ways. Some of the stories are quite dark, some of them are humorous. So I had those stories and I was putting them out, but I felt like, I'll expand to say I was putting them out as standalone ebooks on all the retail platforms for 99 cents. And so I had these stories and I felt like there was maybe more I could do with them. And right around that time, I was listening to Mark Lefebvre's Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. And he just kind of, in passing, mentioned short fiction. And so I got in touch with him and I said, that's really interesting. I'm really interested in the topic of short fiction. Do you think you could do an episode on that? And so Mark, being the gracious guy he is, did an episode on it. And then I got in touch with him again and I said, there's so much information in that episode that I think that could become a book. And would you be interested in co-authoring a book? Which fortunately he said he was. And so that became Taking the Short Tack, Creating Income and Connecting with Readers Using Short Fiction. And it was great because Mark came at it with much more traditional market short fiction publishing experience. And I was coming at it with the indie perspective. And I did decide that I wanted to at least try everything we suggested in the book. And so I did write a story specifically for the traditional market. I submitted it to a platform and I followed the advice that Mark and I also give, but that I got from Douglas Smith's Playing the Short Game, which is if you're going to write short fiction and submit it to the traditional publishing market, start with the top because why not? And so I sent it off to, one of the big names in the sort of suspense thriller mystery genre. And weeks went by, months went by, nothing. And I finally just decided, this isn't for me. Like there's a reason I'm an indie author, and it's because I don't feel like waiting around for somebody to get to my work in a slush pile and tell me it's good enough to publish. And also there are just many, many, many more wonderful short stories than there are traditional market slots to put them in. So that really helped me recommit to indie even for my short stories. But that was kind of the background of how I became interested in short fiction.
All right. I can really identify with the writing of the short stories. After I wrote my second novel, I had an idea for a short story, and I was listening to the podcast Writing Excuses, and Mary Robinette said a line along. I don't even remember what it was, other than somebody had asked her about where they keep the dead bodies, and she said something along the lines of, we have 12 acres in a gully, so wherever. And that just sparked this idea of a story for me. And so there's this legend in Walker County, Alabama, which is like 45 minutes northwest of here. And I don't know the degree that it's legend versus truth or whatever, but you can hire, and this part's true for sure, historically in the last 100 years, Walker County is known that you can hire a hitman for very cheap, and they will take care of whatever problem it is that you're having. And I mean, not CNN, but 60 Minutes episodes have been done on this, whatever. And so and there's a legend that many years ago, if you like put a bag of money with a name in it in this particular tree, then that, there's your contract and that's all you need. And so I had this idea for, the story about a family of hillbilly hitmen. Like, that's the family business. That's their trade. That's what they do. And ended up writing a 7,000 word short story about it. And I loved it. And I want to write more in that universe. And so many people who have read that have said, I want to read more about these people. And, for me, I hope to get back to that. I haven't yet, but I mean, I can already see like the Godfather version of the hillbilly hitman in Alabama is kind of how I see that. And so, but it sparked so many, people who aren't necessarily interested in the other things that I write. I can branch out, and short fiction is a good way to gauge reader interest.
Yeah, especially if you decided that maybe you wanted to take that to novel length works, then it would be super useful to test that out with short fiction and see how your readers like it. Like, see how many of your readers of your other genre might follow you to this new genre. See if it's going to hold their interest. See if it's going to hold your interest, because if you start in on what you think is going to be an 80,000 word novel and then you're at 50,000 words and you're bored, then that's kind of heartbreaking. And you can figure that out with short fiction. You can also use it as kind of a palate cleanser between projects. Like if you're switching from a fiction project to a nonfiction project or back, or if you're stuck, and you just need a little boost and, just decide, okay, I'm going to write 10 100 word stories over the next 10 days. And when I'm done, I'm going to see if maybe my creative spark has been rejuvenated a little bit.
Yeah, and that's the palate cleanser is another way that I've used it. Is just between books, I want to keep writing something just to keep sharp and make sure that part of my brain is still engaged, but I'm not quite mentally or emotionally ready to jump into the next thing. I think it's really great for that.
I also just had the experience of doing my first collaborative fiction work with a friend. So my friend Jane Gorman is another Philadelphia area author, and she writes, among other things, the Adam Kaminsky series. And it's funny because before I discovered Jane's books, Ann Kinnear's old boyfriend is named Dan Kaminsky. And so when I met Jane Gorman and I read the Adam Kaminsky books, I kept teasing her that Dan was Adam's cousin, and that we had to get Ann and Adam together at some point, to address a mystery. And so we've been working on that. And it was very interesting because I don't think I could ever do this with a novel length work. And if I were Jane, I probably wouldn't be able to do it either. But it was so interesting to see how differently we approach things. And when I'm writing fiction, I tend to think on the page. So I'll put, Anne could go up the hill to talk with her brother about it, or they could meet in the diner, which would be more atmospheric but less convenient, or something like that. And so that's just how I think through things. And so Jane had to sit through reading all my little notes to myself about that. But it was also nice because she could read that and then she could say, oh, let's definitely do it at the diner, because I know a really good diner we can use as the basis. But yeah, it was a really cool experiment that I would never have tried to do with a longer work.
Well, there's also a professional basketball player named Frank Kaminsky. So, if you can find a way to tie him in, then you'll have the trifecta.
The whole Kaminsky family.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So one thing I wanted to ask you about and make sure we're coming kind of to the close here, and we have hinted around this. This is going to go back to our original conversation about framework, and particularly as it pertains to people who just want to write and they want to discover it as they go. I think this might pertain to them. Have you found that this framework process has taken any joy out of discovering, as you write? Has it taken anything away from that part of the creativity?
Yeah, that is a great consideration for people to factor into this, because I did this mainly because I'm trying to make a living at this now, and I have to make it efficient. And I have to say that there is a point where, I described it, first of all, it's 4,000 words, then it's 10,000 words. Then, I'm sweeping through it and adding the detail and the dialogue as things go along. And at some point, it becomes a workmanlike effort. It stops being like, oh, fun, creating. It's a workmanlike effort. And I think that there's a great analogy in the boat building world there too. I doubt that any boat builder goes into the boat shop every day and says, oh, right, sanding. It just doesn't work like that. But if you want a waterproof vessel, a waterproof craft, then you do that work. And so there have been periods where, I get to the end of one pass, I go to the begin and I think, ugh. But I do believe it's helping me put books out faster, and I do believe it's helping me put out better books. So I'm willing to do that. And I'll also say that the one thing that I don't think a frame is ever going to be good for people, it's going to be less useful for people, is for character development. And I had a really interesting conversation with Jeff Elkins, the dialogue doctor. You can imagine that he's all about dialogue. So there's episode 106 of the Dialogue Doctor podcast was all about story framing. And we were talking about framing versus, well, we sort of started out as framing versus dialogue, because he's a big proponent of writing dialogue only drafts. And then when we were done, we realized it really wasn't a versus kind of thing, because there were definitely character considerations for Anne Kinnear 6 that I didn't fully understand based on the frame, which is more plot focused, and I didn't understand until I wrote the dialogue. So there were a couple of cases where I was writing the dialogue that the character needed to say in order to conform to the frame I had for the plot, and I thought, oh, it's just not good. This is not working out at all. And I did have to make some pretty considerable adjustments to the plot and to the character involvement and so on, because of what I discovered in writing the dialogue. So I think if someone's just starting out, then I probably wouldn't recommend the frame unless it just feels appealing to you. If you're hearing what I'm saying and you're thinking, oh yeah, that would be a great idea for me to capture the story I have in my mind, then certainly do that. But I think if you're just starting out, just do whatever seems fun to you, because getting the words on the page is the most important thing. And then if you get stuck, or if you get to the end of a draft and you're not quite sure what to do next, then you can start looking through this toolbox of, oh, dialogue only, a frame, do I want a spreadsheet, whatever that might be. But yeah, do whatever sounds fun.
I think that's perfect. And effectively, that's what I did. For the first novel that I finished was Vulcan Rising. And it was based, the first two, or I guess it started out as the first two chapters, but it came chapters 2 and 3, were based on a dream that I had. And I've talked about that here before. And so I just started writing into that and not really knowing where it was going. And I wrote the first 7 or 8 chapters and sent that to somebody to make sure it wasn't awful. And they gave me some feedback that was super helpful about a different direction to take the story and what might be more interesting. And at that point, after writing what was, I don't 15,000 words, I realized I have reached the limit of what I can do without some organization here. Mm-hmm. And so that's when I sat down And I've mentioned Sean Coyne before, and I'll mention it again here. His book Action Story is very short. I think it's less than 100 pages, but it goes through all the obligatory scenes and all the things that you need to do to make sure that you are meeting readers' expectations. And so I really structured the rest of the book around those principles that are laid out in there. And it gave me what I needed after, I'd had the fun of the 15,000 words or so that got into it, and realized I need help. I need some structure because I don't really know what I'm doing. And it gave me that structure that I needed, and it enabled me to write, the next 55,000 words and get the project done. So I think that's really great advice. That not everybody's going to fit into this. And if you're not trying to make a living at it, or maybe you hope to eventually, but right now you're exploring the writing of things, then do what's comfortable. And when you need help, know that there are resources out there that can help you get that work done.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. So before we go, Matty, please tell people where they can connect with you and find the work that you do.
Well, if they are interested in my fiction work, they can go to mattydalrymple.com, and that's Matty with a Y, Matty. And if they are interested in my nonfiction platform, they can go to theindieauthor.com, and that's Indie with a Y, Indy.
All right. All wise, all the way around. Thank you so much for your time. I really loved this conversation, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is great.